side.
Yeah. Hey, I'm A side. You're
A side.
side.
Nigga, get the fuck up. Get the fuck up.
Right guys, welcome to the first episode of Social Slugfest. I'm excited to bring you this new series simply because it's a bit outside the box of just standard boxing and standard MMA, and it's basically talking about YouTube boxing scene, influencer boxing scene. So if that isn't your cup of tea, you know, in the future don't click on a Social Slugfest video, but if it is, then buckle your seatbelt because I'm going to be going over why I still think KSI is the A side over Jake Paul. So there was a lot of back and forth around the time of the Gibb fight over who is the A side, whether it's Jake Paul or whether it's KSI. And if you're just a spectator looking from the outside in, you would presume that it's now Jake Paul because he's obviously been a lot more active in the past 3 years. So KSI's last fight was actually in November 2019 against Logan Paul, and since then Jake has beaten Ben Askren, Nate Robinson, he's beaten Tyron Woodley twice as well. So he's been very active, and he's also got that fight over Gibb. However, there's more to this than meets the eye. So if I go firstly into social media numbers, you can see a little table here on the screen, and that is basically comparing KSI, Jake Paul to basically the two biggest names in boxing at the minute, which I believe to be Anthony Joshua and Canelo Alvarez. As you can see from the numbers, on YouTube, KSI is massive. For Canelo, I've used obviously DAZN Boxing, he doesn't have his own channel, but you can see KSI is obviously miles ahead of the rest, which you would expect because it's obviously, that's his bread and butter basically. If you look at Canelo and AJ Skill in boxing, it's miles ahead of KSI, simply because that is their job, that's his job, okay? In terms of Instagram and Twitter, we can now kind of start looking at how these fighters and YouTubers have marketed themselves. As you can see on Instagram, it's quite even across the board. Jake's slightly in front, but you can see with the numbers, KSI, AJ, Canelo, they're all roughly around the same. So the popularity is similar. And for Twitter, again, pretty even. But the real thing, what I want us to look at is, I went back and looked at the views on their previous fights that they've had on YouTube. So this is a real good indicator because I didn't just look at the highlights, I made sure I looked at the full fight, because most people are going to want to watch the highlights if they're not really that into it. But if you watch the full fight and you've clicked on the full fight, then that shows that you have an interest in it. So if you go back and look at KSI's full fight against Logan Paul 2, it was loaded on Sky Sports and also DAZN, and that is racked up a whopping 26.7 million views. The only thing I could really find close to that was Anthony Joshua versus Klitschko, which had 25 million. So it basically shows how big of a fight that actually was in terms of social media and bringing in viewers on YouTube as well. Jake's largest fight that I could find was against Nate Robinson, that had 10.8 million views, and that was over 2 channels as well. So in comparison, KSI comes in almost double the amount of numbers that Jake Paul was able to bring in to watch his fight again on YouTube. Whether this might just be because of the controversy in the KSI fight, so people wanted to go back and watch it and try and score the fight again, I'm not too sure, but he is a clear winner in this as his views speak for themselves basically. Okay, so in terms of their previous fights and their next fight, so by the time them two actually fight, who is going to garner more interest? Is there going to be something that propels one of them more than the other? So Jake's next fight is rumoured to be against Tommy Fury. I think this is a massive fight, and it's going to have a huge effect on who the A side will be going into the KSI Jake Paul fight further down the line, simply because Jake has been asked several times to fight an actual boxer, and he's got a novice boxer in Tommy Fury, and it looks like that fight is coming together. Big John Fury said recently that it's in negotiations, and there's been rumours that Tommy Fury has had sparring partners in to basically mimic Jake Paul. So that looks like where Jake is going next. In terms of KSI, he hasn't fought in 3 years, so I believe the hunger is there from his fans to see him get back in the ring. It looks like at the moment he will be fighting a guy from America called Alex Wasabi. So he's not that known to the UK audience, but he has got a lot of followers on YouTube, a lot of subscribers on YouTube in the US. But the main purpose of this fight is this guy's been calling KSI out. He beat Deji, who's KSI's brother, and I think KSI wants to go out there and show everybody that he has been training, he's been working hard over the past 3 years, and boxing is something that he takes very seriously. He's been training at shoot boxing at the minute in London, and I honestly believe that if that fight happens, KSI will put a bad beating on Alex. That's another video. That's something we'll cover close to the time. But in terms of the next fights, who's going to bring in more interest? I personally believe that the Tommy Fury and Jake Paul fight will be very, very interesting, simply because this will be the first real test for Jake in terms of boxing. So he's had obviously ex-UFC champions. He's had Ben Askren, who was a champion in other organisations such as Bellator. He's had basketball players, but this is the first actual boxer we're going to see Jake Paul get in the ring with, so it will prove a lot. As for KSI, I think the best thing he can do to obviously propel this fight even more is go out there and put away Alex Wasabi in devastating fashion. If he looks good out there, people will then start to believe he may have this against Jake, because at the moment Jake is probably going to be a massive favourite going into that fight. Now, this is where I think we get the real A side and B side of the fight, and this is basically who has more popularity outside of just the social media world. So we're going to dive into this a little bit, and I'm going to kind of go through the knowledge, like the recent achievements, not acknowledgements, of both guys. And in terms of popularity outside YouTube, KSI has, in the last few years, he's transcended YouTube. He is probably now a household name in the UK. The guy's appeared at Reading and Leeds Festival, which, other than Glastonbury, is probably the biggest festival in the UK. He's appeared on many UK daytime TV shows like Good Morning Britain and Lorraine. He's always on UK radio stations, and I'm not just talking about these small radio stations. I'm talking about BBC, Radio 1, I'm talking about Capital. He's on all of these, playing constantly, and it shows with his Spotify monthly listeners as well. He's reached a massive 5 million monthly listeners on his Spotify, which is absolutely crazy numbers. There's a lot of actual big UK musicians that don't have anywhere near 5 million monthly listeners. So that was kind of a fact that blew my mind, even more than all the social media numbers and stuff that I would expect. He's also now really partnered up with Jake Paul's brother to release a hydration drink called Prime, which is apparently, well, we don't have it here yet. I think it's basically getting released in the next couple of weeks in Asda over here. But in America, they can't apparently keep the shelves stocked for long enough because it's just constantly selling out. So that's another thing that I'll be talking about close to the fight, Logan's relationship and KSI and Jake Paul, this whole triangle going on. So there's some of KSI's achievements. In terms of Jake Paul, I think Jake Paul has not really ventured into pop culture as much, but he's really become a big name within the fighting scene. So whether it's UFC or boxing, the guy's name is brought up everywhere, and that's because he is such a polarizing character. He's got this persona where he'll goad other fighters. He's obviously gone at Canelo, Conor, you name it, he's gone at everyone basically. So he's showed up at UFC shows, and he's had confrontations with bloody DC, who's massive. Like, why would you want to start on a guy like that, firstly? He's co-promoted the biggest women's fight ever in Taylor Serrano with Eddie Hearn. So obviously his face was in boxing media constantly throughout that whole period. He dropped a diss track on Dana White, which was strange, but the song's not bad actually, to be fair. And yeah, he's just stayed relevant really, even between his fights. Like he's obviously been active, but even in between his fights, like, he's constantly being covered in every media outlet there is there. So I think if you kind of break them down, KSI has gathered more of a general audience across the UK, especially becoming a household name, whereas Jake Paul has really tried to break that stigma of YouTube boxing within the fight scene, and he's really pushed himself into those conversations with UFC fighters and with boxers as well. So I think both guys at the end of the day they've obviously grown massively over the last 2 to 3 years. This now speaks volumes about who the A side and B side is. So in Jake Paul's last fight against Woodley, the numbers were pretty bad. The reported numbers were 65k, under 65k pay-per-view buys, which isn't great. Apparently his fight with Ben Askren done 1.5 million. I don't know if I believe that. It was on Triller. It was just fucking crazy, to be honest. Yeah, it was mental. But then you look at KSI and Logan Paul. The first fight was a non-professional fight and it done 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. That number is slightly exaggerated simply because of the fact that the pay-per-view sold for £10. So obviously it wasn't priced as a normal pay-per-view, which would be like $24.95 or $29.99 over here in the UK. But there was obviously talks about how the second fight didn't do so well in the UK. So the DAZN numbers were really good for the KSI Logan Paul second fight, but apparently in the UK, KSI only managed to get 216,000 pay-per-view buys on Sky Sports, which is still a lot more than Jake Paul and Woodley 2 done. So for someone that doesn't do very well with the pay-per-view buys, that is pretty insane still. And even online, it's been speculated that because of piracy and stuff, like they lost out on like 1.9 million pay-per-view buys or something. But piracy is always going to be a thing, unfortunately, for the fighters, and it's just something that's going to have to be dealt with in the future. But I hope you've enjoyed this analysis. I hope you've enjoyed the breakdown of why I think the social media numbers, the next fights that they're having, and their actual popularity outside of social media determines who is the A side and B side in the fight. For me, it's still going to be KSI unless Jake Paul proves a point against Tommy Fury, in which he can then flip the script. But please comment down below. Let me know who you think the A side is. Let me know who you think the B side is. And stay tuned for more videos on YouTube boxing, influencer boxing, and whatever comes our way. This has been Social Slugfest, and I'm Sunny Somal. Peace.